It was now the 6th of November. Our passage promised to be shorter than that of the Jane. We had no need to hurry, however. Our schooner would arrive before the gates of the iceberg wall would be open. For 3 days the weather caused the working of the ship to be unusually laborious, and the new crew behaved very well. Thereupon the boatswain congratulated them. Hurl eagerly bore witness that Hunt, for all his awkward and clumsy build, was in himself worth 3 men. "A famous recruit," said he. "Yes, indeed," I replied, "and gained just at the last moment." "Very true, Mr. Georling, but what a face and head he has, that Hunt." "I have often met Americans like him in the regions of the far west," I answered, "and I should not be surprised if this man had Indian blood in his veins. Do you ever talk with Hunt?" "Very seldom, Mr. Georling. He keeps himself to himself and away from everybody. And yet, it is not for want of mouth. I never saw anything like his. And his hands. Have you seen his hands? Be on your guard, Mr. Georling, if ever he wants to shake hands with you." "Fortunately, boatswain, Hunt does not seem to be quarrelsome. He appears to be a quiet man who does not abuse his strength." "No, except when he is setting a halyard. Then I am always afraid the pulley will come down and the yard with it." Hunt certainly was a strange being, and I could not resist observing him with curiosity, especially as it struck me that he regarded me at times with a curious intentness. On the 10th of November, at about 2 in the afternoon, the lookout shouted, "Land ahead, starboard." An observation had just given 55 degrees 7 letter 2b9 latitude and degrees 13 letter 2b9 longitude. This land could only be the Isle de St. Pierre. Its British names are South Georgia, New Georgia, and King George's Island, and it belongs to the circumpolar regions. It was discovered by the Frenchman, Barbe, in 1675 before Cook. But although he came in second, the celebrated navigator gave it the series of names which it still bears. The schooner took the direction of this island, whose snow-clad heights, formidable masses of ancient rock, rise to an immense altitude through the yellow fogs of the surrounding space. New Georgia, situated within 500 leagues of Magellan Straits, belongs to the administrative domain of the Falklands. The British administration is not represented there by anyone. The island is not inhabited, although it is habitable, at least in the summer season. On the following day, while the men were gone in search of water, I walked about in the vicinity of the bay. The place was an utter desert, for the period at which sealing is pursued there had not arrived. New Georgia, being exposed to the direct action of the Antarctic polar current, is freely frequented by marine mammals. I saw several droves of these creatures on the rocks, the strand, and within the rock grottos of the coast. Whole smallas of penguins, standing motionless in interminable rows, braid their protest against the invasion of an intruder. I allude to myself. Innumerable larks flew over the surface of the waters and the sands. Their song awoke my memory of lands more favored by nature. It is fortunate that these birds do not want branches to perch on, for there does not exist a tree in New Georgia. Here and there I found a few phanerogams, some pale-colored mosses, and especially tussock grass, in such abundance that numerous herds of cattle might be fed upon the island. On the 12th November the Halbrane sailed once more, and having doubled Charlotte Point at the extremity of Royal Bay, she headed in the direction of the Sandwich Islands, 400 miles from thence. So far we had not encountered floating ice. The reason was that the summer sun had not detached any, either from the icebergs or the southern lands. Later on, the current would draw them to the height of the 50th parallel, which, in the southern hemisphere, is that of Paris or Quebec. But we were much impeded by huge banks of fog, which frequently shut out the horizon. Nevertheless, as these waters presented no danger, and there was nothing to fear from ice packs or drifting icebergs, the Halbrane was able to pursue her route towards the Sandwich Islands comfortably enough. Great flocks of clangorous birds, breasting the wind and hardly moving their wings, passed us in the midst of the fogs, petrels, divers, halcyons, and albatross, bound landwards, as though to show us the way. Owing, no doubt, to these mists, we were unable to discern Traversey Island. Captain Len Guy, however, thought some vague streaks of intermittent light which were perceived in the night, between the 14th anth, probably proceeded from a volcano which might be that of Traversey, as the crater frequently emits flames. On the 17th November, the schooner reached the archipelago to which Cook gave the name of Southern Thule in the first instance, as it was the most southern land that had been discovered at that period. He afterwards baptized it Sandwich Isles. James West repaired to Thule in the large boat, in order to explore the approachable points, while Captain Len Guy and I descended on the Bristol Strand. We found absolutely desolate country. The only inhabitants were melancholy birds of Antarctic species. Mosses and lichens cover the nakedness of an unproductive soil. Behind the beach, a few firs rise to a considerable height on the bare hillsides, from whence great masses occasionally come crashing down with a thundering sound. Awful solitude reigns everywhere. There was nothing to attest the passage of any human being, or the presence of any shipwrecked persons on Bristol Island. West's exploration at Thule produced a precisely similar result. A few shots fired from our schooner had no effect but to drive away the crowd of petrels and divers, and to startle the rows of stupid penguins on the beach. While Captain Len Guy and I were walking, I said to him, "You know, of course, what Cook's opinion on the subject of the Sandwich Group was when he discovered it. At first he believed he had set foot upon a continent. According to him, the mountains of ice carried out of the Antarctic Sea by the drift were detached from that continent. He recognized afterwards that the Sandwiches only formed an archipelago, but nevertheless his belief that a polar continent farther south exists remained firm and unchanged." "I know that is so, Mr. Georling," replied the captain, "but if such a continent exists, we must conclude that there is a great gap in its coast, and that Weddell and my brother each got in by that gap at 6 years' interval. That our great navigator had not the luck to discover this passage is easy to explain. He stopped at the 71st parallel, but others found it after Captain Cook, and others will find it again." "And we shall be of the number, Captain." "Yes, with the help of God." Cook did not hesitate to assert that no one would ever venture farther than he had gone, and that the Antarctic lands, if any such existed, would never be seen, but the future will prove that he was mistaken. They have been seen so far as the 84th degree of latitude. "And who knows," said I, "perhaps beyond that by Arthur Pym." "Perhaps, Mr. Georling. It is true that we have not to trouble ourselves about Arthur Pym, since he, at least, and Dirk Peters also, returned to America." "But supposing he did not return?" "I consider that we have not to face that eventuality," replied Captain Len Guy. Chapter 11. From the Sandwich Islands to the Polar Circle. The Halbrane, singularly favored by the weather, sighted the New South Orkneys group in 6 days after she had sailed from the Sandwich Islands. This archipelago was discovered by Palmer, an American, and Bothwell, an Englishman, jointly, in 1821-22. Crossed by the 61st parallel, it is comprehended between the 44th and the 47th meridian. On approaching, we were enabled to observe contorted masses and steep cliffs on the north side, which became less rugged as they neared the coast, at whose edge lay enormous ice floes, heaped together in formidable confusion. These, before 2 months should have expired, would be drifted towards the temperate waters. At that season, the whaling ships would appear to carry on the taking of the great blowing creatures, while some of their crews would remain on the islands to capture seals and sea elephants. In order to avoid the strait, which was encumbered with islets and ice floes, Captain Len Guy first cast anchor at the southeastern extremity of Laurie Island, where he passed the day on the 24th. Then, having rounded Cape Dundas, he sailed along the southern coast of Coronation Island, where the schooner anchored on the 25th. Our close and careful researches produced no result as regarded the sailors of the Jane. The islands and islets were peopled by multitudes of birds. Without taking the penguins into account, those guano-covered rocks were crowded with white pigeons, a species of which I had already seen some specimens. These birds have rather short, conical beaks and red-rimmed eyelids. They can be knocked over with little difficulty. As for the vegetable kingdom in the New South Orkneys, it is represented only by gray lichen and some scanty seaweeds. Mussels are found in great abundance all along the rocks. Of these we procured an ample supply. The boatswain and his men did not lose the opportunity of killing several dozens of penguins with their sticks, not from a ruthless instinct of destruction, but from the legitimate desire to procure fresh food. "Their flesh is just as good as chicken, Mr. Georling," said Herr eagerly. "Did you not eat penguin at the Kerguelens?" "Yes, boatswain, but it was cooked by Atkins." "Very well then, it will be cooked by Endicott here, and you will not know the difference." And in fact, we in the saloon, like the men in the forecastle, were regaled with penguin, and acknowledged the merits of our excellent sea cook. The Halbrane sailed on the 26th of November at 6 o'clock in the morning, heading south. She reascended the 43rd meridian. This we were able to ascertain very exactly by a good observation. This route it was that Weddell and then William Guy had followed, and provided the schooner did not deflect either to the east or the west, she must inevitably come to Tsalal Island. The difficulties of navigation had to be taken into account, of course. The wind, continuing to blow steadily from the west, was in our favor, and if the present speed of the Halbrane could be maintained, as I ventured to suggest to Captain Len Guy, the voyage from the South Orkneys to the polar circle would be a short one. Beyond, as I knew, we should have to force the gate of the thick barrier of icebergs, or to discover a breach in that ice fortress. So that in less than a month, Captain, I suggested tentatively. In less than a month I hope to have found the iceless sea which Weddell and Arthur Pym describe so fully, beyond the ice wall, and thenceforth we need only sail on under ordinary conditions to Bennet Island in the first place, and afterwards to Tsalal Island. Once on that wide open sea, what obstacle could arrest or even retard our progress? I can foresee none, Captain, so soon as we shall get to the back of the ice wall. The passage through is the difficult point. It must be our chief source of anxiety, and if only the wind holds. It will hold, Mr. Georling. All the navigators of the austral seas have been able to ascertain, as I myself have done, the permanence of this wind. That is true, and I rejoice in the assurance, Captain. Besides, I acknowledge, without shrinking from the admission, that I am beginning to be superstitious. And why not, Mr. Georling? What is there unreasonable in admitting the intervention of a supernatural power in the most ordinary circumstances of life? And we, who sail the Halbrane, should we venture to doubt it? Recall to your mind our meeting with the unfortunate Patterson on our ship's course, the fragment of ice carried into the waters where we were, and dissolved immediately afterwards. Were not these facts providential? Nay, I go farther still, and am sure that, after having done so much to guide us towards our compatriots, God will not abandon us. I think as you think, Captain. No, his intervention is not to be denied, and I do not believe that chance plays the part assigned to it by superficial minds upon the stage of human life. All the facts are united by a mysterious chain. A chain, Mr. Georling, whose first link, so far as we are concerned, is Patterson's ice block, and whose last will be Tsalal Island. Ah, my brother, my poor brother. Left there for 11 years with his companions in misery, without being able to entertain the hope that succor ever could reach them. And Patterson carried far away from them, under we know not what conditions, they not knowing what had become of him. If my heart is sick when I think of these catastrophes, Mr. Georling, at least it will not fail me unless it be at the moment when my brother throws himself into my arms. So then we too were agreed in our trust in Providence. It had been made plain to us in a manifest fashion that God had entrusted us with a mission, and we would do all that might be humanly possible to accomplish it. The schooner's crew, I ought to mention, were animated by the like sentiments, and shared the same hopes. I allude to the original seamen who were so devoted to their captain. As for the new ones, they were probably indifferent to the result of the enterprise, provided it should secure the profits promised to them by their engagement. At least, I was assured by the boatswain that such was the case, but with the exception of Hunt. This man had apparently not been induced to take service by the bribe of high wages or prize money. He was absolutely silent on that and every other subject. If he does not speak to you, boatswain, I said, neither does he speak to me. Do you know, Mr. Georling, what it is my notion that man has already done? Tell me, Herr Legerly. Well then, I believe he has gone far, far into the southern seas. Let him be as dumb as a fish about it. Why he is dumb is his own affair. But if that sea hog of a man has not been inside the Antarctic Circle, and even the ice wall by a good dozen degrees, may the first sea we ship carry me overboard. From what do you judge, boatswain? From his eyes, Mr. Georling, from his eyes. No matter at what moment, let the ship's head be as it may, those eyes of his are always on the south, open, unwinking, fixed like guns in position. Herr Legerly did not exaggerate, and I had already remarked this. To employ an expression of Edgar Poe's, Hunt had eyes like a falcon's. When he is not on the watch, resumed the boatswain, That savage leans all the time with his elbows on the side, as motionless as he is mute. His right place would be at the end of our bow, where he would do for a figurehead to the halbrane, and a very ugly one at that. And then, when he is at the helm, Mr. Georling, just observe him. His enormous hands clutch the handles, as though they were fastened to the wheel. He gazes at the binnacle, as though the magnet of the compass were drawing his eyes. I pride myself on being a good steersman, but as for being the equal of Hunt, I'm not. With him, not for an instant does the needle vary from the sailing line, however rough a lurch she may give. I am sure that if the binnacle lamp were to go out in the night, Hunt would not require to relight it. The fire in his eyes would light up the dial and keep him right. For several days our navigation went on in unbroken monotony, without a single incident, and under favorable conditions. The spring season was advancing, and whales began to make their appearance in large numbers. In these waters, a week would suffice for ships of heavy tonnage to fill their casks with the precious oil. Thus the new men of the crew, and especially the Americans, did not conceal their regret for the captain's indifference in the presence of so many animals worth their weight in gold, and more abundant than they had ever seen whales at that period of the year. The leading malcontent was Hearn, a sealing master, to whom his companions were ready to listen. He had found it easy to get the upper hand of the other sailors by his rough manner, and the surly audacity that was expressed by his whole personality. Hearn was an American, and 45 years of age. He was an active, vigorous man, and I could see him in my mind's eye, standing up on his double-bowed whaling boat brandishing the harpoon, darting it into the flank of a whale, and paying out the rope. He must have been fine to see. Granted his passion for this business, I could not be surprised that his discontent showed itself upon occasion. In any case, however, our schooner was not fitted out for fishing, and the implements of whaling were not on board. One day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I had gone forward to watch the gambols of a school of the huge sea mammals. Hearn was pointing them out to his companions, and muttering in disjointed phrases. "There, look there, that's a finback. There's another and another, 3 of them with their dorsal fins 5 or 6 feet high. Just see them swimming between 2 waves, quietly making no jumps. Ah, if I had a harpoon, I bet my head that I could send it into one of the 4 yellow spots they have on their bodies. But there's nothing to be done in this traffic box. One cannot stretch one's arms. Devil take it. In these seas it is fishing we ought to be at, not." Then stopping short, he swore a few oaths and cried out, "And that other whale?" "The one with a hump like a dromedary?" asked a sailor. "Yes, it is a humpback," replied Hearn. "Do you make out its wrinkled belly and also its long dorsal fin? They're not easy to take, those humpbacks, for they go down into great depths and devour long reaches of your lines. Truly, we deserve that he should give us a switch of his tail on our side, since we don't send a harpoon into his. There, look there, that's a finback. There, look there, that's a finback." Look out," shouted the boatswain. This was not to warn us that we were in danger of receiving the formidable stroke of the humpback's tail, which the sealing master had wished us. No, an enormous blower had come alongside the schooner, and almost on the instant, a spout of ill-smelling water was ejected from its blowhole with a noise like a distant roar of artillery. The whole foredeck to the main hatch was inundated. "That's well done," growled Hearn, shrugging his shoulders, while his companions shook themselves and cursed the humpback. Besides these 2 kinds of cetacea, we had observed several right whales, and these are the most usually met with in the southern seas. They have no fins, and their blubber is very thick. The taking of these fat monsters of the deep is not attended with much danger. The right whales are vigorously pursued in the southern seas, where the little shellfish called whales' food abound. The whales subsist entirely upon these small crustaceans. Presently, one of these right whales, measuring 60 feet in length, that is to say, the animal was the equivalent of 100 barrels of oil, was seen floating within 3 cables' lengths of the schooner. "Yes, that's a right whale," exclaimed Hearn. "You might tell it by its thick, short spout. See that one on the port side like a column of smoke, that's the spout of a right whale. And all this is passing before our very noses, a dead loss. Why, it's like emptying moneybags into the sea, not to fill one's barrels when one can. A nice sort of captain indeed to let all this merchandise be lost, and do such wrong to his crew." "Hearn," said an imperious voice, "go up to the maintop. You will be more at your ease there to reckon the whales." "But sir—" "No reply, or I'll keep you up there until tomorrow. Come, be off at once." And as he would have got the worst of an attempt at resistance, the sealing master obeyed in silence. The season must have been abnormally advanced, for although we continued to see a vast number of testations, we did not catch sight of a single whaling ship in all this fishing ground. I hasten to state that, although we were not to be tempted by whales, no other fishing was forbidden on board the Halbrane, and our daily bill of fare profited by the boatswain's trawling lines, to the extreme satisfaction of stomachs weary of salt meat. Our lines brought us goby, salmon, cod, mackerel, conger, mullet, and parrotfish. The birds which we saw, and which came from every point of the horizon, were those I have already mentioned: petrels, divers, halcyons, and pigeons in countless flocks. I also saw, but beyond aim, a giant petrel. Its dimensions were truly astonishing. This was one of those called quebrantanizos by the Spaniards. This bird of the Magellanian waters is very remarkable. Its curved and slender wings have a span of from 13 to 14 feet, equal to that of the wings of the great albatross. Nor is the latter wanting among these powerful winged creatures. We saw the dusky-plumed albatross of the cold latitudes, sweeping towards the glacial zone. On the 30th of November, after observation taken at noon, it was found that we had reached degrees 23'2B9 3'2BA of latitude. The Halbrane had then crossed the polar circle, which circumscribes the area of the Antarctic zone. Chapter 12. Between the polar circle and the ice wall. Since the Halbrane has passed beyond the imaginary curve drawn at 23.5 degrees from the pole, it seems as though she had entered a new region, that region of desolation and silence, as Edgar Poe says, that magic person of splendor and glory in which the Leonora's singer longed to be shut up to all eternity, that immense ocean of light ineffable. It is my belief, to return to less fanciful hypotheses, that the Antarctic region, with a superficies of more than 5 millions of square miles, has remained what our spheroid was during the glacial period. In the summer, the southern zone, as we all know, enjoys perpetual day, owing to the rays projected by the orb of light above its horizon in his spiral ascent. Then, so soon as he has disappeared, the long night sets in, a night which is frequently illumined by the polar aurora or northern lights. It was then in the season of light that our schooner was about to sail in these formidable regions. The permanent brightness would not fail us before we should have reached Sallel Island, where we felt no doubt of finding the men of the Jane. When Captain Len Guy, West, and the old sailors of the crew learned that the schooner had cleared the 66th parallel of latitude, their rough and sunburnt faces shone with satisfaction. The next day, Hurliguerly accosted me on the deck with a broad smile and a cheerful manner. "So then, Mr. Georling," said he, "we've left the famous circle behind us." "Not far enough, boatswain, not far enough." "Oh, that will come, but I am disappointed." "In what way?" "Because we have not done what is usual on board ships on crossing the line." "You regret that?" "Certainly I do, and the Halbrane might have been allowed the ceremony of a southern baptism." "A baptism? And whom would you have baptized, boatswain, seeing that all our men, like yourself, have already sailed beyond this parallel?" "We? Oh yes, but you?" "Oh no, Mr. Georling. And why, may I ask, should not that ceremony be performed in your honor?" "True, boatswain. This is the first time in the course of my travels that I have been in so high a latitude." "And you should have been rewarded by a baptism, Mr. Georling." "Yes, indeed, but without any big fuss, no drum and trumpet about it, and leaving out old Father Neptune with his masquerade. If you would permit me to baptize you." "So be it, Hurliguerly," said I, putting my hand into my pocket. "Baptize as you please. Here is something to drink my health with at the nearest tavern." "Then that will be Bennet Islet or Sallel Island, provided there are any taverns in those savage islands, and any Atkinses to keep them." "Tell me, boatswain, I always get back to Hunt. Does he seem so much pleased to have passed the polar circle as the Halbrane's old sailors are?" "Who knows, there's nothing to be got out of him one way or another. But, as I have said before, if he has not already made acquaintance with the ice barrier." "What makes you think so?" "Everything and nothing, Mr. Georling. One feels these things, one doesn't think them. Hunt is an old sea dog who has carried his canvas bag into every corner of the world." The boatswain's opinion was mine also, and some inexplicable presentiment made me observe Hunt constantly, for he occupied a large share of my thoughts. Early in December, the wind showed a northwest tendency, and that was not good for us, but we would have no serious right to complain so long as it did not blow due southwest. In the latter case, the schooner would have been thrown out of her course, or at least she would have had a struggle to keep in it, and it was better for us, in short, not to stray from the meridian which we had followed since our departure from the New South Orkneys. Captain Len Guy was made anxious by this alteration in the wind, and besides, the speed of the Halbrane was manifestly lessened, for the breeze began to soften on the 4th, and in the middle of the night it died away. In the morning the sails hung motionless and shriveled along the masts. Although not a breath reached us, and the surface of the ocean was unruffled, the schooner was rocked from side to side by the long oscillations of the swell coming from the west. "The sea feels something," said Captain Len Guy to me, "and there must be rough weather on that side," he added, pointing westward. "The horizon is misty," I replied, "but perhaps the sun towards noon." "The sun has no strength in this latitude, Mr. Georling, not even in summer." Jem. West came up to us. "What do you think of the sky?" "I do not think well of it. We must be ready for anything and everything, Captain." "Has not the lookout given warning of the first drifting ice?" I asked. "Yes," replied Captain Len Guy, "and if we get near the icebergs the damage will not be to them. Therefore, if prudence demands that we should go either to the east or to the west, we shall resign ourselves, but only in case of absolute necessity." The watch had made no mistake. In the afternoon we sighted masses, islets they might be called, of ice, drifting slowly southward, but these were not yet of considerable extent or altitude. These packs were easy to avoid, they could not interfere with the sailing of the Halbrane, but although the wind had hitherto permitted her to keep on her course, she was not advancing, and it was exceedingly disagreeable to be rolling about in a rough and hollow sea which struck our ship's sides most unpleasantly. About 2 o'clock, it was blowing a hurricane from all the points of the compass. The schooner was terribly knocked about, and the boatswain had the deck cleared of everything that was movable by her rolling and pitching. Fortunately, the cargo could not be displaced, the stowage having been effected with perfect forecast of nautical eventualities. We had not to dread the fate of the Grampus, which was lost owing to negligence in her lading. It will be remembered that the brig turned bottom upwards, and that Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters remained for several days crouching on its keel. Besides, the schooner's pumps did not give a drop of water. The ship was perfectly sound in every part, owing to the efficient repairs that had been done during our stay at the Falklands. The temperature had fallen rapidly, and hail, rain, and snow thickened and darkened the air. At 10 o'clock in the evening, I must use this word, although the sun remained always above the horizon, the tempest increased, and the captain and his lieutenant, almost unable to hear each other's voices amid the elemental strife, communicated mostly by gestures, which is as good a mode as speech between sailors. I could not make up my mind to retire to my cabin, and seeking the shelter of the roundhouse, I remained on deck, observing the weather phenomena and the skill, certainty, celerity, and effect with which the crew carried out the orders of the captain and West. It was a strange and terrible experience for a landsman, even one who had seen so much of the sea and seamanship as I had. At the moment of a certain difficult maneuver, 4 men had to climb to the crossbars of the foremast in order to reef the mainsail. The first who sprang to the ratlins was Hunt. The second was Martin Holt. Bury and one of the recruits followed them. I could not have believed that any man could display such skill and agility as Hunt S. His hands and feet hardly caught the ratlins. Having reached the crossbars first, he stretched himself on the ropes to the end of the yard, while Holt went to the other end, and the 2 recruits remained in the middle. While the men were working, and the tempest was raging round us, a terrific lurch of the ship to starboard under the stroke of a mountainous wave flung everything on the deck into wild confusion, and the sea rushed in through the scupper holes. I was knocked down, and for some moments was unable to rise. So great had been the incline of the schooner that the end of the yard of the mainsail was plunged 3 or 4 feet into the crest of a wave. When it emerged, Martin Holt, who had been astride on it, had disappeared. A cry was heard, uttered by the sailing master, whose arm could be seen wildly waving amid the whiteness of the foam. The sailors rushed to the side and flung out one a rope, another a cask, a third a spar, in short, any object of which Martin Holt might lay hold. At the moment when I struggled up to my feet, I caught sight of a massive substance which cleft the air and vanished in the whirl of the waves. Was this a second accident? No, it was a voluntary action, a deed of self-sacrifice. Having finished his task, Hunt had thrown himself into the sea that he might save Martin Holt. 2 men overboard. Yes, 2, one to save the other. And were they not about to perish together? The 2 heads rose to the foaming surface of the water. Hunt was swimming vigorously, cutting through the waves, and was nearing Martin Holt. Hunt to the rescue! Hunt to the rescue! They are lost, both lost, exclaimed the captain. The boat, West, the boat. If you give the order to lower it, answered West, I will be the first to get into it, although at the risk of my life. But I must have the order. In unspeakable suspense, the ship's crew and myself had witnessed this scene. None thought of the position of the Halbrane, which was sufficiently dangerous. All eyes were fixed upon the terrible waves. Now fresh cries, the frantic cheers of the crew, rose above the roar of the elements. Hunt had reached the drowning man just as he sank out of sight, had seized hold of him, and was supporting him with his left arm, while Holt, incapable of movement, swayed helplessly about like a weed. With the other arm, Hunt was swimming bravely and making way towards the schooner. A minute, which seemed endless, passed. The 2 men, the one dragging the other, were hardly to be distinguished in the midst of the surging waves. At last Hunt reached the schooner, and caught one of the lines hanging over the side. In a minute Hunt and Martin Holt were hoisted on board. The latter was laid down at the foot of the foremast, and the former was quite ready to go to his work. Holt was speedily restored by the aid of vigorous rubbing. His senses came back, and he opened his eyes. Martin Holt, said Captain Len Guy, who was leaning over him, you have been brought back from very far. Yes, yes, Captain, answered Holt, as he looked about him with a searching gaze. But who saved me? Hunt, cried the boatswain. Hunt risked his life for you. As the latter was hanging back, Hurl eagerly pushed him towards Martin Holt, whose eyes expressed the liveliest gratitude. Hunt, said he, you have saved me, but for you I should have been lost, I thank you. Hunt made no reply. Hunt, resumed Captain Len Guy, don't you hear? The man seemed not to have heard. Hunt, said Martin Holt again, come near to me, I thank you, I want to shake hands with you. And he held out his right hand. Hunt stepped back a few paces, shaking his head with the air of a man who did not want so many compliments for a thing so simple, and quietly walked forward to join his shipmates, who were working vigorously under the orders of West. Decidedly, this man was a hero in courage and self-devotion, but equally decidedly, he was a being impervious to impressions, and not on that day either was the boatswain destined to know the color of his words. For 3 whole days, the 6th, 7th, and 8th of December, the tempest raged in these waters, accompanied by snowstorms which perceptibly lowered the temperature. It is needless to say that Captain Len Guy proved himself a true seaman, that James West had an eye to everything, that the crew seconded them loyally, and that Hunt was always foremost when there was work to be done or danger to be incurred. In truth, I do not know how to give an idea of this man. What a difference there was between him and most of the sailors recruited at the Falklands, and especially between him and Hearne, the sealing master. They obeyed, no doubt, for such a master as James West gets himself obeyed, whether with good or ill will. But behind backs what complaints were made, what recriminations were exchanged. All this, I feared, was of evil presage for the future. Martin Holt had been able to resume his duties very soon, and he fulfilled them with hearty goodwill. He knew the business of a sailor right well, and was the only man on board who could compete with Hunt in handiness and zeal. Well, Holt, said I to him one day when he was talking with the boatswain, what terms are you on with that queer fellow Hunt now? Since the salvage affair, is he a little more communicative? No, Mr. Jeorling, and I think he even tries to avoid me. To avoid you? Well, he did so before, for that matter. Yes, indeed, that is true, added Hurl eagerly. I have made the same remark more than once. Then he keeps aloof from you, Holt, as from the others. From me more than from the others. What is the meaning of that? I don't know, Mr. Jeorling. I was surprised at what the 2 men had said, but a little observation convinced me that Hunt actually did avoid every occasion of coming in contact with Martin Holt. Did he not think that he had a right to Holt's gratitude, although the latter owed his life to him? This man's conduct was certainly very strange. In the early morning of the 9th, the wind showed a tendency to change in the direction of the east, which would mean more manageable weather for us. And, in fact, although the sea still remained rough, at about 2 in the morning, it became feasible to put on more sail without risk, and thus the Halbrane regained the course from which she had been driven by the prolonged tempest. In that portion of the Antarctic Sea, the icebacks were more numerous, and there was reason to believe that the tempest, by hastening the smash-up, had broken the barrier of the iceberg wall towards the east. Chapter 13. Along the front of the icebergs. Although the seas beyond the polar circle were wildly tumultuous, it is but just to acknowledge that our navigation had been accomplished so far under exceptional conditions. And what good luck it would be if the Halbrane, in this first fortnight of December, were to find the Weddell route open. There I am talking of the Weddell route as though it were a macadamized road, well kept with milestones, and this way to the South Pole on a signpost. The numerous wandering masses of ice gave our men no trouble. They were easily avoided. It seemed likely that no real difficulties would arise until the schooner should have to try to make a passage for herself through the icebergs. Besides, there was no surprise to be feared. The presence of ice was indicated by a yellowish tint in the atmosphere, which the whalers called blink. This is a phenomenon peculiar to the glacial zones, which never deceives the observer. For 5 successive days the Halbrane sailed without sustaining any damage, without having, even for a moment, had to fear a collision. It is true that in proportion as she advanced towards the south, the number of icebacks increased, and the channels became narrower. On the 14th, an observation gave us 72 degrees 37' 2'B9 for latitude, our longitude remaining the same, between the 42nd and the 43rd meridian. This was already a point beyond the Antarctic Circle that few navigators had been able to reach. We were at only 2 degrees lower than Weddell. The navigation of the schooner naturally became a more delicate matter in the midst of those dim, wan masses soiled with the excreta of birds. Many of them had a leprous look. Compared with their already considerable volume, how small our little ship, over whose mast some of the icebergs already towered, must have appeared. Captain Lenguy admirably combined boldness and prudence in his command of his ship. He never passed to leeward of an iceberg, if the distance did not guarantee the success of any maneuver whatsoever that might suddenly become necessary. He was familiar with all the contingencies of ice navigation, and was not afraid to venture into the midst of these flotillas of drifts and packs. That day he said to me, "Mr. Georling, this is not the first time that I have tried to penetrate into the polar sea, and without success. Well, if I made the attempt to do this when I had nothing but presumption as to the fate of the Jane to go upon, what shall I not do now that presumption is changed into certainty? I understand that, Captain, and of course your experience of navigation in these waters must increase our chances of success." "Undoubtedly. Nevertheless, all that lies beyond the fixed icebergs is still the unknown for me, as it is for other navigators." "The unknown? No, not absolutely, Captain, since we possess the important reports of Weddell, and I must add of Arthur Pym also." "Yes, I know, they have spoken of the open sea." "Do you not believe that such a sea exists?" "Yes, I do believe that it exists, and for valid reasons. In fact, it is perfectly manifest that these masses, called icebergs and ice fields, could not be formed in the ocean itself. It is the tremendous and irresistible action of the surge, which detaches them from the continents or islands of the high latitudes. Then the currents carry them into less cold waters, where their edges are worn by the waves, while the temperature disintegrates their bases and their sides, which are subjected to thermometric influences." "That seems very plain," I replied. "Then these masses have come from the icebergs. One, they clash with them in drifting, sometimes break into the main body and clear their passage through. Again, we must not judge the southern by the northern zone. The conditions are not identical. Cook has recorded that he never met the equivalent of the Antarctic ice mountains in the Greenland seas, even at a higher latitude." "What is the reason?" I asked. "No doubt that the influence of the south winds is predominant in the northern regions. Now, those winds do not reach the northern regions until they have been heated in their passage over America, Asia, and Europe, and they contribute to raise the temperature of the atmosphere. The nearest land, ending in the points of the Cape of Good Hope, Patagonia, and Tasmania, does not modify the atmospheric currents. That is an important observation, Captain, and it justifies your opinion with regard to an open sea. Yes, open, at least, for 10 degrees behind the icebergs. Let us then only get through that obstacle, and our greatest difficulty will have been conquered. You were right in saying that the existence of that open sea has been formally recognized by Weddell. And by Arthur Pym, Captain. And by Arthur Pym. From the 15th of December, the difficulties of navigation increased with the number of the drifting masses. The wind, however, continued to be uniformly favorable, showing no tendency to veer to the south. The breeze freshened now and then, and we had to take in sail. When this occurred, we saw the sea foaming along the sides of the ice packs, covering them with spray like the rocks on the coast of a floating island, but without hindering their onward march. Our crew could not fail to be impressed by the sight of the schooner making her way through these moving masses, the new men among them, at least, for the old hands had seen such maneuvers before. But they soon became accustomed to it, and took it all for granted. It was necessary to organize the lookout ahead with the greatest care. West had a cask fixed at the head of the foremast, what is called a crow's nest, and from thence an unremitting watch was kept. The 16th was a day of excessive fatigue to the men. The packs and drifts were so close that only very narrow and winding passageway between them was to be found, so that the working of the ship was more than commonly laborious. Under these circumstances, none of the men grumbled, but Hunt distinguished himself by his activity. Indeed, he was admitted by Captain Len Guy and the crew to be an incomparable seaman, but there was something mysterious about him that excited the curiosity of them all. At this date, the Halbrane could not be very far from the icebergs. If she held on in her course in that direction, she would certainly reach them before long, and would then have only to seek for a passage. Hitherto, however, the lookout had not been able to make out between the icebergs an unbroken crest of ice beyond the ice fields. Constant and minute precautions were indispensable all day on the 16th, for the helm, which was loosened by merciless blows and bumps, was in danger of being unshipped. The sea mammals had not forsaken these seas. Whales were seen in great numbers, and it was a fairy-like spectacle when several of them spouted simultaneously. With finbacks and humpbacks, porpoises of colossal size appeared, and these Hearn harpooned cleverly when they came within range. The flesh of these creatures was much relished on board, after Endicott had cooked it in his best manner. As for the usual Antarctic birds, petrels, pigeons, and cormorants, they passed in screaming flocks, and legions of penguins, ranged along the edges of the ice fields, watched the evolutions of the schooner. These penguins are the real inhabitants of these dismal solitudes, and nature could not have created a type more suited to the desolation of the glacial zone. On the morning of the 17th, the man in the crow's nest at last signaled the icebergs. 5 or 6 miles to the south, a long dentated crest upreared itself, plainly standing out against the fairly clear sky, and all along it drifted thousands of ice packs. This motionless barrier stretched before us from the northwest to the southeast, and by merely sailing along it, the schooner would still gain some degrees southwards. When the Halbrane was within 3 miles of the icebergs, she lay to in the middle of a wide basin, which allowed her complete freedom of movement. A boat was lowered, and Captain Len Guy got into it, with the boatswain, 4 sailors at the oars and 1 at the helm. The boat was pulled in the direction of the enormous rampart. Vain search was made for a channel through which the schooner could have slipped, and after 3 hours of this fatiguing reconnoitering, the men returned to the ship. Then came a squall of rain and snow which caused the temperature to fall to 36 degrees, 2 degrees 22 C above zero, and shut out the view of the ice rampart from us. During the next 24 hours, the schooner lay within 4 miles of the icebergs. To bring her nearer would have been to get among winding channels from which it might not have been possible to extricate her. Not that Captain Len Guy did not long to do this, in his fear of passing some opening unperceived. "If I had a consort," he said, "I would sail closer along the icebergs, and it is a great advantage to be two when one is on such an enterprise as this. But the Halbrane is alone, and if she were to fail us—" 4 sailors at the oars, and 1 at the helm. 4 sailors at the oars, and 1 at the helm. Even though we approached no nearer to the icebergs than prudence permitted, our ship was exposed to great risk, and West was constantly obliged to change his trim in order to avoid the shock of an ice field. Fortunately, the wind blew from east to north-northeast without variation, and it did not freshen. Had a tempest arisen, I know not what would have become of the schooner. Yes, though, I do know too well. She would have been lost and all on board of her. In such a case the Halbrane could not have escaped. We must have been flung on the base of the barrier.